So welcome, and really going to be focusing here on variant viruses. And this has been kind of my own focus for the last over a year now, and it's really what's been characterizing the pandemic since basically 2021. People who have seen me speak in the last few months, these first couple sections may be familiar, and then the last maybe last half of the talk is pretty fresh. So yeah, we'll talk about emerging variants of concern, talk about Omicron, and talk about kind of where we go from here. So emergence of variants of concern. The SARS-CoV-2 pandemic has been pretty unique in how much sequence data has really been available with this like huge step change in terms of global effort to sequence viruses. There are now over 9 million genomes sequenced and shared publicly through gisaid.org. And then with nextstrain.org, we've been tracking this evolution in real time, providing kind of daily updates as things have evolved. If we go back to the very beginning of the pandemic in spring 2020, this kind of genomic tracking was most useful for epi understanding when there wasn't a lot of testing or kind of case-based surveillance to understand initial pandemic spread. Early on, we didn't have a lot of evolution that was really substantial. The biggest thing was this D614G mutation. So this happened early on in the epidemic within China, and it was the thing that basically seeded the majority of the European outbreak, and then spread from there, and then pretty rapidly by like summer-ish 2020, almost all global viruses descended from this single mutation. And after this point, there wasn't a lot going on. The focus here has really been on spike. So this is D614G. I'll talk about these mutations. This is D to G at site 614 in spike protein. Spike is really the focus of our attention and really the focus for the virus's evolution, because it's really critical for actual binding to ACE2 and entry of the variant into the host cell, and also is really where our immune response is targeted, particularly in the S1 domain and particularly in RBD in the N-terminal domain. And so it's really where even before we kind of observed anything, where we would have expect most of the action to be in terms of virus evolution. So if we then go to fall 2020, we can see we get the first kind of real action going on with the emergence of these repeated mutations at 484K and 501Y across the world. And so we see this is not just, this is what gives us alpha, beta, gamma, et cetera, but it's actually occurring again and again. And some things take off more than others. And so this is really kind of the first swath of this really important evolution. What we see with alpha is kind of a jump where all of a sudden we get a bunch of mutations all kind of hand in hand, mostly in spike protein, some other places. We see this ORF1AB deletion pop up again and again. We get a very similar pattern with beta emerging in South Africa and with gamma emerging in Brazil and spreading in South America. And so then what we see is that during this initial time, there's not quote variant viruses. We get emergence of beta spreading in Southern Africa, alpha spreading in Europe, gamma spreading in South America. We get kind of regional dominance of these three. Delta then emerges in India, and then quickly then spreads throughout the world and basically displaces everything. And so if we see by October as 2021, basically everything was Delta. Over 99% of things that were being collected from all over the world.
What is going on? Like, what is happening with everyone tonight?
Maddie, yes, thank you. And so if we look then at this point, kind of South America had been a bit of a holdout, but by October, basically there had been complete displacement. And before we get on to Omicron, let's just kind of look at what was going on at this point. So up to here, we were seeing at a genomic level, these variant viruses had additional mutations, but not a whole lot. So this is kind of a classic way to look at this sort of data from phylogenomics, where you plot on the x-axis time and the y-axis divergence. And we expect a molecular clock, which we can see in gray here nicely. The variant viruses are kind of above this and have some additional mutations, but not a huge amount. However, if we look particularly at the S1 domain of spike, we can see a much different picture, where the non-variant viruses had D614G is down here. The non-variant viruses have 1 or 3 mutations, whereas the variant viruses have up to through Delta have 8 or 10. And so this is kind of this anecdotal observation, or more or less anecdotal observation, that there's a lot of evolution in spike. And so with this this work, we really, Katie Kistler in the lab and John Holliston sought to assess the amount of adaptive evolution going on and to kind of quantify this in spike versus other regions of the genome. So here we took a phylogeny of 10,000 genomes, where we tried to sample these as equitably as possible in space and time to avoid sampling biases. If you just took what's in the database, a very large fraction is from the US, the UK, and Europe. And so we wanted something that was more representative of the global pandemic. And so then the kind of main thing that we did was look at particular clades of virus. So clades are these nested structures where there's a descendants of a particular virus. And we can look at which are growing in frequency and which are declining in frequency. And so here we see this is Delta at the time, that's growing rapidly. Other variants are growing at some rate, and non-variant viruses are kind of decreasing at that point. And so what we then see is that if we look at, this is what we just saw, where if we look at the date versus mutations, we see a lot of evolution in S1. But you can see that this is really driven by, and you can kind of see evidence of actual adaptive evolution here, where the viruses that have more mutations in S1 tend to be growing faster in general. And those clades of viruses will be outcompeting viruses that have fewer mutations. And so it's really this kind of selective effect that causes this high rate of evolution in S1. And we can compare S1 to other regions of the genome, where we see just in terms of this correlation, S1 is the strongest. There's a couple other regions that come up decently strongly, like ORF7A and SP6. S1 has the highest combination of clade growth and evolutionary rate. ORF8 is pretty interesting in that it tends to get knocked out a bunch. There's a lot of evolution here, but the actual correlation with evolutionary success is a bit less intense. So we can then compare another metric. So this is kind of a fairly bespoke method that we were trying to get at. This is maybe a bit better for general comparison to other viruses or other organisms in general, where we can look at the ratio of non-synonymous changes, so the number of changes that change protein sequence, to synonymous changes that don't change protein sequence, to get a measure of how strong adaptive evolution is. And if we look at this, we see that S1 is much higher than the rest of the genome, and other things are slightly high, but really most of the actions S1, just as we saw right here. And importantly, we can compare this to a number of other viruses, but just as one example, if we compare it to H3N2 influenza, HA1, which should be a similar protein domain, we see that even, and this is up to Delta, this is not Omicron, even only through Delta, there's about 5 times faster evolution in terms of spike S1 evolution than we were seeing in seasonal influenza virus. Some of this is due to, or much of it is due to adaptation to a new host from pandemic, though we didn't see this in 2009 with swine flu. And so that does suggest kind of in general that even before Omicron, that S1 is quite adaptable. And so that we believe that there are mutations arising in S1 due to within host pressures. These increase viral fitness, they are enriched in the population by natural selection. And then even though selection has previously not been for antigenic change, this adaptability, even just through Delta, suggests its potential, which we then realized with Omicron. Okay, so then shifting gears a little bit, thinking about how do we actually measure these transmission dynamics? There are multiple approaches to modeling fitness. One thing that's been had a lot of focus is frequencies, which I think are really helpful. I apologize for this Pango nomenclature. Purple is delta, where if we look across states, and blue is alpha, where we look across states, we can see alpha waves followed by Delta outcompeting. But what's often really helpful to think about is we can have situations where one virus replaces another virus, but it actually doesn't drive an epidemic. So if we look at case counts here, so this is taking CDC case counts and partitioning these by frequency of different variants, we can see that alpha wave is strong in, say, Colorado, but not strong in California, even though it is frequent. And so we often might have the situation where we really want to see in absolute terms whether one variant virus is driving cases or not, rather than just kind of replacing what else is there. So then Marlon Figgins, who's a PhD student in applied math, really kind of focused on this question, and then came up with a Bayesian method to estimate rigorously variant-specific RT based upon case counts and frequency data. So this is an example from Washington State up through, again, Delta wave, where we can see rising cases here, and that corresponds to an increase in frequency of Delta, and we can then partition that into an actual RT value for different, through time, of different viruses, and compare growth rates or fitness advantage of different variants. So when we do this through time, again, only up through the Delta wave, we can see that that even by March, non-variant viruses had an RT less than 1. So each of those infections was leaving fewer than one subsequent infection. Non-variant viruses are dying out even at the beginning of March. Alpha starts to basically be below 1 by May, beta even earlier, gamma also around May. Delta enters with this RT of about 1.5 and doesn't dip below 1 until around October. And so we can kind of assess this time scale at which it takes for these epidemics to unfold. And we can also rigorously assess the transmission rate differences among the different variant viruses, where we see that alpha was about 1.3 times as transmissible as previous quote non-variant viruses. Gamma is a little bit higher, mu is higher still, whereas really Delta was something with about 2.2 times non-variant viruses, and this is really what led Delta to take over the population. Okay, so so this I think really nicely we're able to take a particular variant and assess its RT through time. We'd like to, in future work, try to make this more mechanistic and have understanding from immunoscape phenotype, titer data, as well as mutational spectrum for really what, to kind of provide a prediction of why this particular variant or why this particular virus is taking off. Okay, so so moving on to Omicron, thinking about its emergence and spread. So this is what things currently look like in terms of genetic diversity of circulating viruses, or viruses collected up to this month, up to March 2022. We can see beta, gamma, alpha, kind of the initial variants, delta here. Importantly, with Omicron, it's quite diverged at a genomic level. And as I think everyone is aware, there are two sublineages of Omicron. I think if this had emerged more recently, not if they basically discovered at the exact same time as this, it would have gotten its own WHO label. But for historical reasons, they're both Omicron. So we have Omicron BA1 and Omicron BA2. If we look at a genomic level, they're quite distinct as, say, beta and gamma, or even beta and alpha. But at the spike level, at the RBD in particular, they're quite similar to each other. So we would think that infection by BA1 would provide protection against BA2 and vice versa. So then if we kind of look at that similar pattern that we were seeing before, we see that Delta becomes dominant by October, and basically all global viruses are Delta. Even this taking a year is really fast for evolution. So it takes 3-ish years on average often 5, for a new strain of flu to outcompete and take over the entire global flu population. So having Delta do that in 1 year was remarkable. And then having Omicron do this in the span of basically October to February, March is completely unprecedented. And so we see Omicron BA1 emerge, rapidly displace Delta. Basically, Delta is completely dying out. And then now Omicron BA2 is kind of invading on this BA1 background. And we'll talk more, but I would expect that it will displace BA1 in the coming months. So the kind of key thing that has differentiated Omicron, as I think people are well aware, is how many mutations in spike protein it has. So remember that even up to Delta, this was really rapid compared to other viruses, compared to kind of general adaptive evolution scenarios. So we see these kind of 3 phases that we have now of non-variant viruses in S1 that are slow to evolve. We get this first tranche of variants, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, et cetera, that all have this 8 or 10 or 12 mutations, and this big jump to Omicron-like viruses, where they're kind of at a completely different level in terms of the number of S1 mutations. And so exactly how this came to be is still a bit mysterious. Definitely my favorite hypothesis, and I think the most likely origin for Omicron is that there was evolution during a chronic infection in an immunocompromised individual. We think this is what happened with alpha. We have evidence from case studies of immunocompromised individuals who have chronic infections where there's a lot of evolution during that chronic infection. And you can imagine this as their immune system is not completely functional, but it still exists to some degree, and that creates this kind of cat and mouse game where the immune system is constantly chasing the virus, and it pushes the virus to evolve more rapidly than you would have otherwise. So the main evidence for this is that this pattern here is really only in spike. If you look at the rest of the genome, Omicron doesn't look at all unusual, and so we'd expect the spike-specific focus to be an immunocompromised individual, as opposed to the kind of primary alternative hypothesis of a human to animal back to human spillover event, where we'd expect more adaptation and elsewhere in the genome as well. And then we also have the multiple sublineages. In addition to BA2, there's a BA3 sublineage that's been detected that is also quite diverged. It really hasn't taken off at all, but it exists. So my best hypothesis for what's going on with these 3 sublineages is this is actually all evolution that happened within the same individual. And during that year of evolution, you have diversification into BA1, BA2, BA3. There may have been other spillover events that happen from that individual to population over the year, but these are the 3 successful ones that then take off and spread. It does seem wild, but I don't have another great explanation of what might be going on here. The other hypothesis is that there's human-animal spillover. There's particular mutations that might suggest this, in particular, perhaps a rodent intermediary. I do think this is still a plausible hypothesis, but my money would be on chronic infection as the origin for Omicron, and which does suggest a mechanism for future Omicron-like emergence to occur. We can have chronic infection of something with Delta that is been incubating for the last year, or we could have further in the coming years potential future Omicron-like emergence events. So again, this rate has been absolutely remarkable. If we look even before Omicron, we have in the course of 2021, on average, about 12 substitutions per year of evolution in spike S1, and again, a jump to Omicron. But we can put this, again, in context of influenza by just looking at overall evolutionary rate. And so here's without Omicron, here's Omicron up here. This is H3 and 2 evolution over the course of 6 years. And we see this nice steady accumulation of substitutions in HA1. And this is faster in H3 and 2 than H1N1, than B Victoria. And this corresponds with how frequently we need to update our vaccine. So H3 and 2 has vaccine updates about every year or two, H1 every 3-ish years, BVIC every 6-ish years. And we can see then that that in 2 years, including Omicron, then SARS-CoV-2 has gotten to the same place as it took perhaps 5 years of H3N2 to get to. And so if we keep up this pace, we can very well expect to need to be frequently updating vaccine to keep it effective against ongoing SARS-CoV-2 evolution. And this really high level of spike mutations, again, this 30-odd mutations, that resulted in a large level of immune escape, particularly from symptomatic infection, less so from severe disease, but still some from that. Where if we look, this is really nice data from UK Public Health England, where if we look at Delta, this is the waning that was observed, that in people that are 25 weeks past 2 doses of this is Pfizer in this case, we go from 90-ish% effectiveness to 60-ish% effectiveness. We see that a booster restores this, as we all remember. But if we look at Omicron, of people that were, quote, fully vaccinated, we only had a 10 or 15% vaccine effectiveness to symptomatic infection. Boosters restored this to a large degree, but not perfectly. That 10 weeks out from booster dose, we're at 50, 60% effectiveness against symptomatic infection. Boosters really helped much more to restore effectiveness against hospitalization. But so we get this situation where most people in the world are more like this category than like this category. Some people have been fully vaccinated and infected, puts you more like here. But there's kind of a lot of now newly susceptible hosts that were previously inaccessible to the virus, but are now susceptible to the virus with Omicron's kind of new phenotype. And so this drives these very large scale epidemics. So we could see this is time here, blue line is Delta, red line is Omicron, and the y-axis is daily cases on a log scale. So this really kind of clear straight lines on a log scale is exponential growth, and this is kind of a good way to look at it. And we can see this very rapid 2 to 3 day doublings that were driving these large epidemics across a large number of countries, USA down here. And they reach a very high peak, and then we get decline because basically immunity has built up. And then we get decline that's been mostly ongoing. We're now seeing upticks in parts of Europe, which we'll get into. And then we also have countries like New Zealand, South Korea, and Hong Kong, and so forth, that are more recently kind of getting delayed Omicron waves that are now picking up at this point. We can measure initial RT in this case, or RT through time of these Omicron waves, where if we look, say, in the US, it arrives at a 3, and then over the course of that wave, as immunity is built up in the population, it declines, drops below 1 in mid-January. This is when the Omicron wave peaks in the US, and it's declining as long as the red line is below this. And so we see that, say in the United Kingdom, this was below 1, it's now recently increased again. Australia has increased again. Other countries have been mostly below 1, and that we see that Delta has been consistently below 1 here. I would note that this RT of 3 as the kind of Omicron wave comes in is basically what the initial pandemic wave was back in spring 2020. And we could imagine that if we didn't, as a rough approximation, if we didn't do social distancing like we did and lockdown and mitigation and all the things that we did in spring 2020, the initial pandemic waves would have had these levels of caseloads of the million a day that we reached with Omicron, but then with much more severe outcomes. So if we look at this attack rate, we estimate that that up to March 3rd, I believe here, that the US has seen about 10% of the country, of 10% of the population has been confirmed as an infection with Omicron, as a confirmed case. Uh, and so we know that it's a bit of a guess that we're currently detecting about 1 in 5 infections as the case. It might be 1 in 4. I think 1 in 5 might be the bet now with the amount of rapid tests and so forth. So my best guess then is that we'd estimate about 50% of the country has been infected with Omicron, and this was in the span of, most of this was in the span of about 10 weeks. You can compare this to a flu season that we generally expect 10 or 20% of the population to be infected over the span of about 20 weeks. So it's kind of much higher attack rates than we see with seasonal influenza. And this level of infection, then, we've basically boosted 50% of the population with an Omicron specific antigen. And that is really what has then driven down the RT because we've created all this immunity, or the epidemic has created all this immunity in the population. And so this dynamic really caused very similar patterns across different states. So this is U.S. states. Each line is a particular state. We get epidemic growth rate as it comes in. Again, this is these 2 to 3 day doublings that were early on. As it approaches a peak, this slows, and now everything has been declining at a very similar pace as well. And that, again, this downturn is due to accumulation of population immunity. So at this point, we now have BA2 on the rise, as I mentioned before. So this is the same exact idea. We're splitting cases, estimating cases split across variants. Yellow is BA1, red is BA2. And we can see that in basically every situation, BA2 has been gaining on BA1 recently. And in particular, if we look at the US, we're about hitting kind of this equal point where we have about as many BA2 cases as BA1 cases. This is a bit of a nowcast where the last 10-ish days of data don't exist because of the pace of genome sequencing. And so kind of we know it back here, and we're kind of estimating what we see over here. And so so we see BA2 taking off, and that appears really to be what's been driving the upticks that we've seen in some European countries, Germany, UK, Switzerland, where they had been where in absolute terms BA1 was on the decline, but BA2 is now increasing in frequency, increasing in absolute prevalence. If we look at RT, we can see this play out, where again, red line is BA2, yellow line is BA1. And we can see that in basically every situation in every country, the red line is systematically above the yellow line, which indicates that BA2 is more fit than BA1, has a transmission advantage. We don't think this is due to immunity. Again, the spike protein and particularly the RBD are very similar, but elsewhere in the genome, we then believe that some suite of mutations is making BA2 more intrinsically transmissible, giving it perhaps a 30% advantage over BA1. So if we just let this play out, we strongly suspect that BA2 will displace BA1 in the coming weeks and months, and all viruses will descend from BA2. It's possible that in that span of time, there will be new mutations that appear on BA1 that kind of bring it up to par or make it surpass BA2, and then you can imagine them both co-circulating or something else happening. But if we just took kind of them as they stand today, we very much expect BA2 to displace and become the founder virus. And this, and this 30% is roughly the difference between non-variant viruses and alpha virus. So it's not as big as the jump to Delta, but it is significant. And so kind of the only silver lining to all of this was that, and this was of course debated as it was happening, but that there is real reduced severity to Omicron infections. So a lot of the apparent reduced severity is due to immunity, that most of the Omicron cases, or a large fraction of the Omicron cases, were in individuals with prior immunity because of this immune escape phenotype. This causes cases to be more mild. But in addition to this, we have a real effect on intrinsic severity. So this is work with Washington Department of Health and using kind of the amazing sequencing that's been happening in Washington State from a number of groups to estimate the relative risk of hospitalization once you control for vaccination history, age, and so forth of different variant viruses. And we can see that that alpha was more likely to put someone in a hospital than non-variant viruses. And Delta was over 2 times more likely to put someone in the hospital, whereas Omicron is back to about what non-variant viruses were. And again, maybe perhaps 2-fold lower than Delta. And this is really nice to have happened. It's not clear if we could re-evolve this this more severe phenotype. That is something to be concerned about. But fortunately, where we stand today then is that that due to this reduced intrinsic severity as well as due to population immunity, we've had a real drop, a very significant drop in case fatality rate across many geographies. So the red line is observed daily deaths. The gray dashed line is a prediction of daily deaths by taking cases, lagging them, and taking some fraction of cases. And so the US had previously had a very keyed in case fatality rate of 1.5. And that was actually basically preserved through Delta, through a combination of most of these being in non-vaccinated individuals and Delta being more severe and so forth. Whereas when we get to Omicron here, we can see this big difference, and that by the gigantic caseloads of 800,000 plus a day, that we would have expected 12,000 deaths a day if it had maintained that severity, which is a bit terrifying. But the fact that we had this more like 2,000, more like the previous waves, indicates a much lower case fatality rate. And we get a very similar picture in other countries where some places like the UK kind of had this disconnect more early on due to broader vaccination and so forth. But it's even strong. You can see it being stronger with Omicron in basically every case. And so here, very roughly, at this point, my best guess is that we've dropped now, moving from case fatality rate to infection fatality rate from at the beginning of the pandemic, IFR, infection fatality rate, was about 0.5% of infections will result in a death, and now it's about 0.05%. So rather than 1 in 200, about 1 in 2,000, which puts it about where seasonal influenza is, which is great. We have to worry about things like long COVID and perhaps a restoration of a more severe phenotype, but at the moment, the best guess is due to population immunity and Omicron that the IFR is like seasonal influenza. So, so moving on to future perspectives, we have a few minutes left. So this is kind of the big mystery of what's going to happen in the next year. We can definitely expect some amount of flu-like drift. Again, we saw that spike protein was quite evolvable. We'll expect individual mutations or handfuls of mutations within Omicron to kind of spread and take over. But we could also have a chronic infection incubating a new wildly divergent virus that takes off and really expands. And exactly how likely this is super hard to guess at. Basically, all we have in mostly is that we have 2.3 years of virus evolution that we've observed. We've had Omicron happen once. And if that's the only thing we have, it's not at all clear whether we just got unlucky and the true rate of Omicron-like events is quite rare, or if it's a common feature of SARS-CoV-2 endemic evolution. So if you do a simple kind of naive Bayesian calculation from this data point, we could get a 80% credible interval for at the faster end, these Omicron-like emergence events would happen every year and a half. At the slower end, they might only happen every 10 years. They might be quite rare. And so when we project this forward for the rest of 2022, in this very naive fashion, we think that it's quite likely, 70% chance, that we don't get another Omicron-like event in 2022, but still a decent chance of Omicron-like event occurring. So I think that we have to be humble here and kind of allow for the possibility of a again a wildly drifted strain that would again drive large caseloads. So likely scenarios, I think the more likely scenario is that we get continued evolution within BA2, and this increases intrinsic transmission, some immune escape. We get lower attack rates, but we still get decent attack rates driven by this drift, waning, and seasonality that we'd expect then a COVID season in 2022, 2023 winter months. Or we can get another Omicron-like emergence event that really drives caseloads to very high levels. And then if we think kind of more broadly and trying to just think about what endemic COVID looks like, the three parameters here that really matter are R naught, circulation level, and antigenic drift, and IFR. So in terms of R naught, with Omicron, it's perhaps 6-ish, maybe even more with BA2 compared to R naught of flu of 2. So even with everything else the same, we'd expect more SARS-CoV-2 circulation than seasonal flu circulation. And then as we've talked about in the presentation, we see that S1 in SARS-CoV-2 evolves much faster, at least up to this point, than seasonal influenza HA1. So this would again suggest higher rates of circulation. But fortunately, IFR is now quite similar. So I imagine endemic, things could change, but I imagine endemic COVID to be a little like seasonal flu. We have a lot of cases, a lot of infections every year, but deaths resulting from infection are rare. But because there's just so many infections, we'll still have a fair number of deaths each winter due to this COVID season. And if we had to then make some super hand wavy guesses here, I would guess at a seasonal attack rate of 40%. So seasonal influenza usually attack rate is thought to be 10 or 20%. So I'm adjusting this upwards again due to R naught and due to rate of antigenic drift. And then an Omicron-like emergence event could easily push this to 80% if that occurred. And then if we assume an IFR of 0.05, this is basically what is currently happening with Omicron, then we just basically multiply these things together. And for the US, this would give 60,000 deaths a year at endemicity. New variants could push this up over 100. So this is not at all pandemic levels, which is really nice, but it would still be kind of the worst seasonal respiratory virus that's circulating, and something that's perhaps twice as bad as seasonal influenza, again, due to these higher attack rates. We'll see if this unfolds. This would suggest that we should be doing our best with continued vaccine updates and antivirals and kind of all of the kind of biomedical innovations that we can have to just deal with this sustained burden of disease. And I will, on that happy note, I will stop there. Thank for this amazing genomic data. It's really people from all over the world contributing. GISAID for curation, NextGen team for their work, and then particular work that I talked about today from John, Katie, and Marlon and Miguel. And with that, I will pause or close for questions. It looks like we have maybe 15 minutes.